Picture this. It's 301 AD. You're a baker in Rome, the heart of the most powerful empire the world has ever known. Yesterday, a loaf of bread cost you 2 denarii to make and you sold it for 4. Today, the emperor has just issued a new edict. That same loaf now costs you 8 denarii to produce, but you're forbidden by law from charging more than 4. You're not just losing money, you're bleeding it. Within weeks, you'll close your shop. Within months, bread will vanish from the markets entirely. And within a generation, the eternal city, the Rome of marble temples and aqueducts, of legions and senators, will be a shadow of itself, its economy in ruins, its population starving, its currency worthless. This isn't a story about barbarians at the gates. This is about something far more insidious. This is about how Rome didn't fall to an invading army. It imploded from within, victim to an economic death spiral that started centuries before the last emperor fell. This is the story of how debt, inflation, and desperation destroyed the greatest economy the ancient world had ever seen. Act I. The Empire of Prosperity, 1:30 to 8 o'clock. To understand how Rome's economy collapsed, we first need to understand just how spectacular it once was. At its height in the 2nd century AD, the Roman Empire wasn't just a political entity, it was an economic miracle. A single currency flowed from Britain to Syria. Roads connected every corner of the empire, enabling trade on a scale that wouldn't be seen again for over 1,000 years. The Mediterranean was a Roman lake, its shipping lanes free from pirates, its ports bustling with grain from Egypt, olive oil from Spain, wine from Gaul. Rome had achieved what economists call a market integration miracle. A merchant in Rome could buy Egyptian grain at roughly the same price as a merchant in Alexandria. Think about that. In an age of ox carts and sailing ships, they'd created an economic zone spanning 3 continents with price stability that rivals modern markets. The numbers are staggering. Modern estimates suggest the Roman Empire's GDP per capita rivaled that of Western Europe in the 17th century. Some scholars estimate the empire's total GDP at the equivalent of 20 to 25% of the entire world's economic output. One empire, 1/4 of global wealth. But here's what made it all work: the denarius. Silver coins, standardized weight, guaranteed purity. When a Roman soldier received his pay, when a merchant closed a deal, when a senator collected his rents, it was all in denarii. The currency was so stable, so trusted, that it remained essentially unchanged for 2 centuries. That's longer than the United States dollar has existed. This monetary stability was the bedrock of everything. It enabled long-distance trade, it facilitated credit markets, it allowed for complex financial instruments. Romans could take out loans, invest in businesses, plan for the future. The wealthy elite invested in agricultural estates, urban real estate, and trading ventures. A middle class of merchants, craftsmen, and small landowners thrived. But there was a problem lurking beneath this prosperity. A problem that would eventually bring the entire system crashing down. Rome's economy was built on conquest. Every major expansion of the empire brought a flood of wealth. Gaul fell and gold poured into Rome. Dacia was conquered, and its gold mines filled the treasury. Egypt became a province, and its grain fed the capital. Each victory meant slaves, precious metals, land, tribute, and trade goods flowing back to Rome. But by the mid-2nd century AD, the conquests had stopped. Under Emperor Hadrian, Rome stopped expanding. The borders were fixed. The frontier became defensive, not offensive. And that's when the arithmetic stopped working. The empire's expenses hadn't stopped growing. The army still needed to be paid. The bureaucracy still needed to function. The grain dole still needed to feed Rome's citizens. But the windfall of conquest wealth had dried up. For the first time in its history, Rome had to sustain its economy not through expansion, but through the productivity of what it already controlled. At first, this wasn't a crisis. The empire was wealthy, the provinces were productive, trade was booming. But cracks were beginning to show. The military was expensive, ruinously expensive. By the early 3rd century, roughly 75% of the imperial budget went to the army. Legions stationed on the Rhine, the Danube, the Euphrates all needed to be paid, fed, and equipped. And as threats from Germanic tribes and the Persian Empire grew, military spending could only go in one direction: up. Meanwhile, the tax base was starting to erode. The empire's wealth had always been concentrated in the hands of the elite: senators, equestrians, and large landowners. These same people had the political influence to avoid taxation. The burden increasingly fell on the middle class: small farmers, merchants, craftsmen, the very people whose productivity made the economy function. And then came the crisis that changed everything. Act 2. The crisis of the 3rd century, 8 to 1800 hours. The year 235 AD is when Rome's economy begins its terminal decline. Not because of a single event, but because this is when the crisis of the 3rd century begins: 50 years of civil war, foreign invasion, economic collapse, and plague that nearly destroyed the empire. Emperor Alexander Severus is assassinated by his own troops. What follows is chaos. In the next 50 years, Rome will have more than 50 claimants to the imperial throne. Emperors last months, sometimes weeks. Some are killed in battle, others assassinated. Many simply disappear from the historical record. But here's what matters for our story. Civil war is expensive. Every would-be emperor needed an army. And armies don't fight for glory, they fight for money. The price of loyalty skyrocketed. Emperors had to pay their troops more and more just to prevent them from switching sides or proclaiming a rival as emperor. But the treasury was empty. The conquests had stopped a century ago. Tax revenues were stagnant or declining. So emperors did what desperate governments always do. They debased the currency. Remember the denarius? That stable silver coin that had been the foundation of Roman prosperity? It was about to become worthless. It started gradually. Emperor Nero had begun the process back in the 1st century, reducing the silver content from 100% to 90%. It seemed harmless. No one really noticed, but it established a precedent. When the state needs money, devalue the currency. By the time of the crisis, emperors were doing it systematically. The denarius, once nearly pure silver, dropped to 70% silver, then 50%, then 30%. By the reign of Gallienus in the 260s, it was down to just 5% silver. The silver coins were basically copper with a silver wash that rubbed off in your hands. Think about what this means. The currency people saved in, invested in, planned their lives around was becoming worthless. A lifetime of savings could evaporate in a decade. A loan taken out in good faith became impossible to repay because the money you earned was worth a fraction of what you'd borrowed. This wasn't inflation as we understand it today. This was currency collapse. Prices spiraled out of control. We have records of wheat prices increasing by 200 times in some regions between 200 and 300 AD. A soldier's salary, once generous, couldn't buy basic necessities. The merchants who had formed the backbone of the economy couldn't afford to do business. The value of their goods changed between the time they bought and sold them. The government's response made everything worse. Emperor Diocletian, who came to power in 284 AD, tried to fix the economy through sheer force of will. In 301 AD, he issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, a document that listed over 1,000 goods and services and set legal maximum prices for each one. It was the most comprehensive price control system ever attempted in the ancient world. And it was a disaster. The edict itself acknowledges the problem. For who is so hard and so devoid of human feeling that he cannot, or rather has not perceived, that in the commerce carried on in the markets or involved in the daily life of cities immoderate prices are so widespread that the unbridled passion for gain is lessened neither by abundant supplies nor by fruitful years. But price controls don't create abundance, they create shortages. Bakers couldn't afford to bake bread at the legal price. Merchants stopped shipping goods. Craftsmen closed their workshops. The black market exploded, with real prices sometimes 10 times the legal maximum. Remember our baker from the opening? This is his moment. He's forced to choose. Operate at a loss and go bankrupt, break the law and risk execution, or simply close his shop. Most chose the latter. Food supplies collapsed. The very thing the price controls were meant to prevent, scarcity, became the new reality. But the currency debasement and price controls were just symptoms. The real disease was the debt spiral. See, the Roman state was now spending far more than it collected in taxes. The difference had to be made up somehow. Debasing currency was one solution, but it was a loan against the future. Each debasement made the next one necessary. It was like a drug addiction. Every fix made you need a bigger fix next time. The state also extracted loans from cities, temples, and wealthy individuals, loans that were never meant to be repaid. These weren't voluntary. They were confiscations dressed up as civic duty. Over time, this destroyed the private capital accumulation that had made Roman prosperity possible. Local elites, who had once competed to fund public works and festivals, now fled their responsibilities. Being a city councilor had once been an honor. Now it was a financial death sentence. Councils were responsible for collecting taxes, and if they couldn't meet their quotas, they had to pay the difference themselves. Families that had been wealthy for generations were bankrupted in a single generation. The middle class, farmers, merchants, craftsmen were caught in a vice. Taxes rose as the tax base shrank, meaning the burden on those who remained increased exponentially. Small farmers, unable to pay their taxes, abandoned their land or sold themselves to large estates in exchange for protection. The independent farmsteads that had been the backbone of the early empire gave way to massive latifundia worked by increasingly unfree labor. Trade began to collapse. Why risk shipping goods across the Mediterranean when your cargo might be confiscated, your ship requisitioned, your profit margin destroyed by currency fluctuations? Long-distance trade gave way to local, subsistence-level exchange. Cities that had bustled with commerce became inward-looking, trying desperately just to feed themselves. The army, ironically, accelerated the collapse. Soldiers now had to be paid increasingly in goods rather than currency. They didn't trust the money. This led to a system of taxation in kind, where farmers had to hand over portions of their crops directly to the military. But this was hideously inefficient. A farmer in Egypt might grow wheat that soldiers in Britain needed, but there was no way to ship it. Instead, local regions had to support whatever troops happened to be stationed there, regardless of whether they were suitable for food production. And then there were the barbarian invasions. Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine and Danube, not in a single overwhelming invasion, but in constant raids that bled the frontier provinces dry. The Persian Empire attacked in the east, actually capturing a Roman emperor, Valerian, in 260 AD, and humiliation that sent shockwaves through the empire. These weren't just military defeats. They were economic catastrophes. Entire provinces were devastated, their farmland destroyed, their cities sacked, their populations enslaved or killed. The empire fragmented. For 15 years, Gaul, Britain, and Spain broke away as the Gallic Empire. In the east, the wealthy city of Palmyra established its own empire under Queen Zenobia. Rome controlled Italy and little else. By 270 AD, the empire was on the brink of total collapse. The economy had shrunk by perhaps half from its second-century peak. Cities were depopulating. Trade networks had fractured. The currency was worthless. The middle class was extinct. And debt, both state debt and private debt, hung over everything like a suffocating fog. But then came the emperors who tried to save Rome. Act 3. The Illusion of Recovery, 18:00–28:00. Diocletian and Constantine, two emperors who would fundamentally transform Rome in their attempts to save it. They succeeded in stabilizing the empire. But the price of that stability was the destruction of the very things that had made Rome great. Diocletian's reforms were comprehensive and ruthless. He doubled the size of the army. It now consumed 90% of state revenue. He quadrupled the size of the bureaucracy. He divided the empire into smaller administrative units, each with its own governor, tax collector, and military commander. The idea was clear: more control, more extraction, more centralization. To pay for this, taxes had to increase. And Diocletian made sure they would be collected. The tax system became hereditary and inescapable. If you were a farmer, you were bound to your land. If you were a baker, your son had to be a baker. If you were a merchant, you couldn't change professions. This wasn't just social policy, it was economic policy. The state needed to know exactly where everyone was and what they produced so it could tax them efficiently. This is the beginning of the system that would eventually become medieval feudalism. Free people were becoming tied to their land, their occupations, their social positions. Social mobility, one of the things that had made Rome dynamic, was being systematically eliminated. Constantine built on Diocletian's system but added one crucial innovation: a new currency. The gold solidus, introduced in 312 AD, was Rome's attempt to restore monetary stability. And it worked, sort of. The solidus maintained its value and remained a stable currency for centuries. But here's the catch. There wasn't enough gold to run the economy on solidi. The solidus was used for large transactions, tax payments, and military salaries. Everything else still ran on the debased copper coins, which continued to inflate. So Rome now had a two-tier monetary system, a stable currency for the elite and a worthless one for everyone else. This formalized the economic divide. The wealthy operated in gold. Everyone else drowned in copper. The late Roman Empire had stabilized, but it was a fundamentally different economic system than the early empire. Let me paint you a picture of what this looked like on the ground. Imagine you're a farmer in Gaul around 350 AD. Your great-grandfather was a free farmer who owned his land and paid taxes to Rome. Your grandfather lost his land during the crisis and became a tenant on a large estate. Your father was declared a colonist, legally bound to the land he farmed. And you? You were born into debt. See, your family's tax burden was inherited. Your father's unpaid taxes became your taxes. You can't leave the land. If you try, you'll be forcibly returned and punished. You can't change professions. Your children will be farmers too, bound to this same land, inheriting this same debt. You produce grain, but you never see much of it. The landlord takes his share. The tax collector takes the state's share in grain, not money. The church, now a major landowner itself, takes its tithe. What's left barely feeds your family. You're not starving, but you're not thriving. You're surviving, and you will pass this survival and this debt to your children. This was the new normal. The economic dynamism of the early empire, where a skilled craftsman could become wealthy, where a merchant could rise to the equestrian class, where a farmer's son could become a soldier and retire with land, was gone. Society had frozen into rigid hierarchies. Cities, once the engines of Roman prosperity, were dying. Many had lost half their population since the 2nd century. The public buildings were crumbling. No one could afford to maintain them. The forums where merchants once traded were empty or given over to agriculture. In some cities, people were farming inside the old city walls, turning urban space back into agricultural land. The great trade networks had simplified into local exchange. Egyptian grain still fed Constantinople, but the complex web of Mediterranean commerce had collapsed into a few major routes. Most regions became economically isolated, producing mostly for their own consumption. Here's a striking statistic. Archaeologists can measure economic complexity by studying pottery. In the 2nd century, Roman pottery was found everywhere, standardized goods shipped across the empire. By the 5th century, most pottery was locally made, crude, and diverse. This isn't just about pots. It's about the collapse of mass production and long-distance trade. The state kept trying to squeeze more from a shrinking base. Tax collectors became predators. There are laws from this period that specify punishments for tax collectors who torture people to extract payment. Some people escaped by fleeing to the countryside, joining groups of bandits, or placing themselves under the protection of powerful landlords who could shield them from state taxation. This was illegal, but it was better than bankruptcy or starvation. The state responded with laws demanding these people be returned, but enforcement was sporadic at best. The army, meanwhile, was becoming less Roman. Recruiting free Roman citizens was increasingly difficult. Why would you join when military pay was irregular and the currency worthless? Instead, the army filled its ranks with barbarian recruits from Germanic tribes. They were paid better, often in gold or land. By the late 4th century, the Roman army was, in many ways, no longer Roman. This created a bizarre situation. Rome was paying Germanic warriors to defend it from other Germanic warriors. And those warriors increasingly realized they didn't need Rome. They could just take what they wanted. But the final blow to the Roman economy wasn't military, it was fiscal. The state's debt burden had become unsustainable. Not formal debt in the modern sense, Rome didn't issue bonds, but structural debt. The state had obligations it couldn't meet. Army salaries, bureaucratic costs, grain subsidies, infrastructure maintenance. Every year, the gap between income and expenses grew. The solution was inflation and confiscation. Inflate away the debt's value, seize assets from the wealthy, impose emergency taxes, debase the currency further. Each of these measures provided short-term relief but long-term disaster. They destroyed incentives to invest, to save, to produce more than the bare minimum. By 400 AD, the Western Roman Empire was economically hollowed out. It still looked like an empire, there were still emperors, still armies, still cities. But the economic foundations had crumbled. The wealth was gone. The productivity was gone. The trust in institutions was gone. When the barbarian invasions came, Visigoths sacking Rome in 410, Vandals crossing into Africa in 429, various Germanic tribes carving up Gaul and Spain, they weren't conquering a mighty empire. They were occupying a corpse. The Eastern Roman Empire, based in Constantinople, survived. And here's the interesting part. It survived because it maintained economic stability. Constantine had made Constantinople the capital in part because the East was still wealthy. Egypt still produced grain, Syria still traded, Anatolia still had productive farms. The East kept functioning because it had avoided the worst of the debt spiral. But in the West, the Roman economy was finished. Act 4. The Lessons of Collapse. 28:00-37:00. So what killed the Roman economy? Was it the barbarians? The plague? Bad emperors? Military overspending? No, it was debt. And the desperate, destructive measures taken to manage that debt. The Roman Empire collapsed because it spent more than it earned for centuries, and when it tried to make up the difference, every solution made the problem worse. It's a pattern that should sound familiar. Currency debasement led to inflation. Inflation destroyed savings and made long-term investment impossible. To control inflation, the state imposed price controls, which created shortages. To collect more taxes, the state increased the burden on those who couldn't avoid it, the middle class, driving them into poverty or dependency. To secure stability, the state locked people into hereditary occupations, destroying social mobility and economic dynamism. Each reform solved an immediate crisis but created worse long-term problems. It's the perfect example of what we might call a debt spiral, where the measures taken to service debt make it harder to escape debt, requiring more extreme measures, which make the problem even worse. Let's look at the mechanisms in detail. First, monetary collapse. Rome discovered what every society that debases its currency discovers. You can't print your way to prosperity. When people lose faith in money, the economy doesn't just slow down. It freezes. Trust is the foundation of any economy, and once it's lost, it's nearly impossible to rebuild. The psychological effect was devastating. Imagine you're a merchant in 250 AD. You've worked your entire life, saved money, planned for retirement. But the currency you saved in is now worth a tenth of what it was. Your life's work is gone. Are you going to continue saving? Are you going to invest in your business? Or are you going to spend everything immediately, hoard physical goods, hide your wealth from the tax collector? This shift from investment to consumption, from long-term planning to short-term survival, cripples an economy. And once it starts, it's self-reinforcing. If everyone expects the currency to devalue, everyone acts to protect themselves, which accelerates the devaluation. Second, the destruction of the middle class. This is crucial. The Roman elite were largely tax-exempt through political influence and legal loopholes. The poor had nothing to take. So the burden fell on the middle, farmers who owned land, craftsmen who owned workshops, merchants who owned shops. These people were productive, law-abiding, and visible to tax collectors. They were squeezed until they broke. Some sold themselves to large estates for protection. Others abandoned their land and disappeared into the countryside. Many simply stopped producing more than they needed to survive. Why work hard when the state will take the surplus? The loss of this middle class was catastrophic. They were the people who generated surplus, who invested in productivity improvements, who created demand for goods. Without them, the economy reverted to subsistence agriculture and local exchange. Third, the militarization of society. When 3/4 of your budget goes to the military, everything else suffers. Infrastructure crumbled. Courts became inefficient. Education declined. The very institutions that make a civilization function were starved of resources. And here's the cruel irony. The military spending didn't even make Rome more secure. By the 5th century, the army was a shadow of its former self. Units were understrength, training was poor, equipment was outdated. Rome was spending more on defense than ever before and getting less security than it had when it spent less. This is what happens when military spending becomes about short-term crisis management rather than long-term security. You throw money at immediate threats without addressing underlying problems. The spending becomes politically impossible to reduce. Try cutting military pay during a civil war, but economically unsustainable to maintain. Fourth, the collapse of trade. This one's subtle but devastating. When long-distance trade dies, so does specialization. When specialization dies, productivity plummets. In the 2nd century, a region of Gaul might specialize in pottery, trading its high-quality goods across the empire. This specialization meant investment in better techniques, better kilns, better clay sources. It meant economic growth. By the 5th century, that same region makes pottery only for local use. There's no incentive to improve. You're not competing with anyone. There's no capital for investment. There's no growth. Everyone is poorer, and no one knows how to fix it because the knowledge of how to run a complex trading economy has been lost. Fifth, the rigidity trap. Diocletian's reforms locked people into hereditary occupations. This guaranteed the state would always have farmers to tax, bakers to feed cities, soldiers to recruit. But it destroyed innovation and efficiency. If a talented baker's son would make a brilliant merchant, too bad. He's legally required to be a baker. If a farmer's land is worn out and he'd be better off in a city, too bad. He's bound to his land. If a new technology could double productivity but requires people to change occupations, too bad, that's illegal. Economic growth requires change, adaptation, creative destruction. Rome legislated against all of it. The result was stagnation, inefficiency, and a slow grinding decline in living standards. But here's what I find most interesting. Rome didn't collapse overnight. The crisis of the 3rd century was horrific, but Rome recovered. The fall in 476 AD was actually kind of anticlimactic. The last Western emperor was a teenager who was pensioned off rather than killed. Rome declined over centuries, and that's the terrifying part, because it means people lived through it without fully realizing what was happening. Each generation was a little poorer than the last. The buildings were a little more run down. The roads were a little worse. Money was a little less valuable. But life went on. It's not until you compare the Rome of 150 AD to the Rome of 450 AD that you see the catastrophe. In those 3 centuries, the greatest economy of the ancient world had simply dissolved. The population of Rome itself tells the story. At its height, the city held perhaps 1 million people. By 450 AD, it was maybe 50,000. The aqueducts were broken, the forums were abandoned, large section of the city had reverted to farmland. The marble facades were being stripped and burned for lime. It was a ghost city, haunted by memories of what it had been. And the economic knowledge was lost. The sophisticated financial instruments, the trade networks, the industrial production techniques, the agricultural science, all forgotten. It would take Europe 1,000 years to rebuild what Rome had achieved. The eternal warning. So here's the question that should keep us up at night. Could it happen again? Look at the mechanisms that destroyed Rome. Currency instability. Check. Every major economy has experimented with monetary policy that previous generations would consider insane. Massive government debt. Check. Debt to GDP ratios in major economies are at or near historical highs. Extreme inequality. Check. Wealth concentration rivals the late Roman Empire in many developed nations. A middle class under pressure. Check. In many countries, the middle class is shrinking as costs rise and wages stagnate. Political instability driven by economic anxiety. Check, just look around. Now, before you think I'm predicting imminent collapse, I'm not. The modern world is vastly different from ancient Rome. We have technology Rome couldn't imagine. We have economic knowledge Rome lacked. We have institutions designed to prevent the kind of spiral Rome fell into. But here's what Rome teaches us. Collapse isn't sudden. It's not barbarians at the gates. It's the slow erosion of trust, productivity, and social cohesion. It's decisions made for short-term relief that create long-term catastrophe. It's the belief that the system is too big, too established, too eternal to fail. Rome believed it was eternal. The Romans of the 2nd century couldn't conceive that their civilization would end. Yet 5 generations later, it was effectively over. The Roman economy didn't implode because of a single bad decision or a single crisis. It imploded because debt created a spiral of desperate measures, each of which made the fundamental problems worse. They debased their currency to pay debts, which created inflation, which required price controls, which created shortages, which required more government intervention, which required more currency debasement. Each step seemed necessary at the time. Each step made sense to the people making the decisions. But the cumulative effect was civilizational collapse. We like to think we're smarter than the Romans. We have economics as a science. We have data. We have history itself as a guide. But the Romans weren't stupid. They were sophisticated, educated, often brilliant. They just faced impossible choices and made understandable decisions that happened to be catastrophic in aggregate. So when you hear about economic policies today, how we manage debt, how we respond to crises, how we balance competing interests, remember Rome. Remember that the greatest economy of the ancient world didn't fall to enemies. It fell to its own internal contradictions, its own short-term thinking, its own desperate attempt to maintain the unsustainable. Rome's economy didn't just implode. It was imploded by 1,000 reasonable decisions, each one making perfect sense at the time, each one moving inexorably toward collapse. The debt spiral consumed the greatest empire the world had ever seen. The question isn't whether it could happen again. The question is, what are we doing to make sure it doesn't?